All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Ever get that feeling, when you're out walking your maze fields and something just doesn't look quite right?
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into a problem that's actually pretty common and can seriously mess with your yields. Maze core twisting.
We're talking about that twisting of the central leaves.
Exactly. And we've pulled together some really solid research, and we're going to break down what exactly is going on when those leaves start doing the twist.
So we've all probably seen this, right? Instead of those central leaves emerging all nice and straight and unfurling like they're supposed to, they get all distorted and twisted and kind of bunched up.
Totally. Sometimes it almost looks like a cow's tail or like a whip or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not just that it looks weird, it's a sign that something's off with the plant's development.
Yeah, for sure. And what the research really highlights is that this twisting, it has some knock-on effects, some pretty serious consequences for the plant. Well, for one, the inner nodes, that's the sections of stalk between the leaves, they end up shorter,
Oh, okay.
which means, of course, overall the plant grows more slowly and it ends up stunted. The stalks themselves, they can also end up thinner and weaker than they should be.
Really?
And if it gets really bad, all that trapped, twisted foliage, it can actually start to rot,
Oh, wow.
which at the end of the day means you could be looking at a smaller harvest and lower quality maize.
Yeah, nobody wants that. So in this deep dive, we're going to really try to get to the bottom of this whole core twisting thing. We want to understand what's causing it, and even more importantly, give you some actionable strategies for stopping it from happening in the first place. And if it does happen, how to manage it effectively.
Yeah, think of this as your one-stop shop for everything maize core twisting.
All right, so let's untwist this mystery, shall we? And it turns out the main culprit behind this whole twisted situation is a tiny little insect called the maize thrips.
Thrips.
Yeah.
You might not think much of them. They're so small, but they can cause a lot of trouble in the field.
Yeah, they pack a punch for their size. But how do they actually do it? Like, how can something so tiny cause that much damage?
Well, it's all in their mouth parts. They've got these specialized rasping-sucking mouth parts that are perfectly designed to mess up young, developing maize tissue.
So rasping sucking, so they're not just chewing away at the leaves.
No, it's more like they scrape the surface, the epidermis of those delicate central leaves, and then they suck out the nutrient-rich sap.
Oh, wow. So they're like little vampires.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, it's not just the feeding itself that causes the twisting.
Yeah?
There's more to it. While they're feeding, they also secrete this, well, imagine a really sticky liquid of viscous mucus.
Oh, okay.
And because they're feeding inside that tight little bundle of central leaves, that mucus gets all over the surfaces of the leaves.
So as the plant's growing and those leaves are trying to open up and unfurl, they're basically glued together by this sticky stuff.
Exactly. And that forces them to twist and deform, to get all contorted into those shapes we were talking about. Imagine trying to unfold a stack of papers that are slightly stuck together.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so it's not just the physical damage, it's also that the plant's losing sap, which means it's losing nutrients, and that weakens the plant, makes it more susceptible to other pests and diseases down the line.
So it's like a domino effect.
Exactly. It all starts with these tiny thrips and their sticky secretions.
Okay, so we know the villain of the story, the maize thrips, but now the big question is, what can we actually do about it? What can growers do to combat this?
Right, so the research points to a pretty comprehensive multi-pronged approach. We need to think about prevention and control.
Okay, well, let's start with prevention. What's the first line of defense?
Well, it might sound a bit surprising, but weed control is super important. Yeah, it turns out that a lot of different weed species can act as what we call intermediate hosts for the thrips. Think of them as like temporary housing for the thrips when there's no maize around for them to feed on.
Like when the maize isn't in the right stage of growth.
Yeah, exactly. And then when the maize seedlings start to emerge, the thrips just move right in,
So weeds are like their vacation home.
basically. A couple of examples mentioned specifically are crabgrass and foxtail grass. These weeds often grow in the same places as maize.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So if you get rid of the weeds, you're getting rid of the thrips hangout spot.
Exactly.
So how do you actually manage those weeds effectively?
Well, you've got a few options, right? You can do it manually, you can use mechanical cultivation, or you can use herbicides.
So basically, you're trying to make the environment as inhospitable to the thrips as possible.
Exactly. You want to discourage them from setting up shop in the first place.
Okay, so weed management, that's the first step. What else can you do to prevent core twisting?
Well, good field management is really key. You want to make sure your maize plants are as healthy and strong as possible. That way, they're more likely to withstand any stress, including thrips infestations.
And that means,
Well, it means things like fertilization and watering, making sure they're getting the nutrients they need and enough water, but not too much.
right, the Goldilocks zone for maize. So what about fertilization specifically? Are there any recommendations on what kind of fertilizers to use?
Well, the research mentions that during the seedling stage, when core twisting is most likely to happen, you want to make sure they've got enough nitrogen. Helps the stems and leaves develop properly.
Okay, so nitrogen's important early on. What about later in the growth cycle?
Well, then the focus shifts to phosphorus and potassium. These are really crucial for the development of the ears and also help the plant stay strong so it doesn't lodge, especially if the stalks have already been weakened by thrips.
Okay, so nitrogen for the seedlings, phosphorus, and potassium later on. Got it. And what about watering?
Yeah, you want to keep the soil moisture consistent, not too dry, not too wet. That's especially important for the seedlings. You don't want them to dry out or get waterlogged.
Makes sense. So, are there any other environmental factors that can affect thrips and core twisting?
Well, one interesting thing the research mentioned was humidity.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, thrips don't really like high humidity environments.
Really?
Yeah. So keeping that in mind, if you're irrigating, you might be able to create a microclimate that's less favorable to thrips.
Okay, so we're preventing the thrips, we're making sure our maize is healthy and strong, but what if we start to see those signs of core twisting? What should we do?
Well, the most important thing is to keep an eye on your fields.
Mm.
Be vigilant, especially during the early stages when you're thinning and when the plants are getting established.
Yeah, so if you do spot those twisted leaves, what's the next step?
You need to act fast. The research recommends uprooting any infected plants right away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but you got to be careful when you're doing it so you don't damage the healthy plants around them.
Right. Okay, so you pull out the infected plants. What do you do with them?
You can't just leave them lying around the field. The thrips could just spread to other plants.
But what should you do?
You got to get them right out of the area and destroy them. You can burn them or bury them deeply. That way you can be sure the thrips are gone.
Okay, so that's about containing the problem, but what about those plants that are already really badly twisted? You know, the ones that have that cowtail look. Is there any way to save them?
Well, in some cases, you can actually intervene manually.
Really? What do you mean?
Well, if the twisting is so bad that the plant can't straighten out on its own, you can try separating the central leaves that are stuck together.
Okay, that sounds delicate. How do you do that?
You have to be super careful. The research suggests using very sharp, clean scissors or a tool like an awl to carefully make a small cut along the middle of the deformed leaf base.
So you're basically trying to break the glue that the thrips created.
Exactly. If you can do that, the leaves should be able to unfurl and start functioning normally again.
So they can still photosynthesize and all that.
Yeah, but it's really important to be gentle. You don't want to cause any more damage to the plant.
Right. I imagine it takes a lot of patience and skill to do this.
It does. It's a pretty labor-intensive method, so it's probably not practical for large-scale infestations. It's more of a last resort for individual plants that you really want to try and save.
Okay, so for larger scale problems, you need something a bit more scalable. What about something like those blue sticky traps? Those sound interesting.
Yeah, those can be pretty effective.
So how do they work?
Well, for whatever reason, thrips are really attracted to the color blue. Scientists aren't totally sure why, but we can use that to our advantage. These traps are basically pieces of blue material that are coated with a very sticky substance.
Okay.
So you hang these traps in your field, and the thrips are drawn to the blue and they get stuck.
Ah, okay, so it's a way to trap and kill the adult thrips.
Right.
But it's a non-chemical method, so that's good.
Exactly. It's a great tool for integrated pest management because it helps you reduce the thrips population without relying on chemicals.
So how many traps do you need?
The research suggests about 20 to 30 traps per moo. Moo is a Chinese unit of area. It's about 667 square meters.
Okay.
And you want to hang them just a bit higher than the maize plants and spread them out evenly throughout the field.
Got it. So we've talked about prevention, we've talked about some more manual control methods, but what about chemical control? When is that necessary?
Well, if you catch the infestation early on, chemical control can be a really effective way to quickly knock down those thrips numbers and stop the core twisting from getting worse.
Oh, okay. So what kind of chemicals are we talking about?
There are a few options. One is a 10% imidacloprid wettable powder.
Okay, and how do you use that?
Well, you need to dilute it with water at a ratio of 1,500 to 1. It's really important to get the dilution right. And when you're spraying, you want to focus on the central leaves where the thrips are most likely to be. Make sure you spray both the top and bottom of the leaves.
Okay. What other options are there?
Well, there's a 20% imidacloprid soluble liquid. That's a more concentrated formula, so you need to dilute it even more, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 to 1.
Wow, that's a lot of water. So are there any non-imidacloprid options?
Yeah, there's 10% cypermethrin EC. That one you dilute 2,500 to 1. It's a good idea to check the product before you use it to make sure it hasn't separated or clumped up.
Okay. And is there anything else?
There's also 40% thiamethoxam water dispersible granules.
And how do you use those?
You mix 8 to 12 grams of the granules with 30 to 45 kilos of water.
Okay.
Make sure you stir it really well so the granules dissolve properly, and then spray the whole plant thoroughly.
Okay. And what about timing? When's the best time to apply these chemicals?
Well, thrips are nocturnal. They tend to hide during the day, so the best time to spray is early in the morning before the dew dries, or in the evening when they're more active.
So you're catching them when they're out and about.
Exactly. And of course, always read and follow the instructions on the label of whatever chemical you're using. It'll tell you the right dosage, how to apply it safely, and any precautions you need to take.
Safety first, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, the key to preventing and controlling maize core twisting is really about managing those thrips. You've got to be proactive, keep those weeds under control, keep your plants healthy, and if you do see signs of an infestation, act quickly.
Right. Don't let those little thrips ruin your hard work.
Exactly.
So to wrap it up for you, maize core twisting, it's that weird twisting of the central leaves that can really affect your yields. And it's mainly caused by those pesky maize thrips and their sticky secretions. But as we've seen, it's not a hopeless situation. There are things you can do to prevent it and to control it.
Yeah, you can keep those weeds down, make sure your plants are getting the nutrients and water they need. And if those thrips do show up, you can use those blue sticky traps. You can even try manually separating the twisted leaves. And if necessary, you can use chemical controls.
And the key takeaway here is early detection and quick action. The sooner you spot the problem and deal with it, the better your chances are of protecting your crop and getting a good yield.
Exactly. It pays to be vigilant.
It really does. Now, here's something to think about. We've been talking about how this tiny little insect, the thrips, can have such a huge impact on a major food crop like maize. It really makes you realize how much power these seemingly insignificant creatures can have. What other unseen interactions are shaping our world, What other tiny forces are out there that we don't even notice, but that are having a big impact on our lives?
That's a good question. It makes you think.
It does. It does. Well, that's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.